My wife invited me to a dinner with her Italian investor. I kept quiet and pretended I didn't understand Italian, but then I heard her say something that made me freeze. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is William, and at 65 years old, I thought I knew everything there was to know about my wife. After 37 years of marriage, I believed Leah and I had no secrets between us. I was wrong about that, dead wrong. It started on a Tuesday morning in March when Leah approached me with unusual excitement in her voice. I was sitting at our kitchen table reading the newspaper and sipping my coffee from the same blue ceramic mug I'd used for the past 15 years. The morning light filtered through our yellow curtains, casting familiar shadows across the oak table my father had built decades ago. "William, darling," Leah said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted something, "I have wonderful news about the business." I looked up from the sports section, noting how she'd applied her makeup more carefully than usual. Her dark hair was styled in that way she reserved for important occasions, and she wore the burgundy blouse I'd bought her for Christmas 3 years ago. "What kind of news?" I asked, folding the newspaper. She practically bounced on her toes. "Remember how I've been working on expanding my interior design consultancy? Well, I've connected with this amazing Italian investor who wants to discuss a partnership. He's flying in from Milan just to meet with us." The way she said "us" made something stir in my chest, though I couldn't identify what. Leah had been running her small interior design business for about 8 years now, ever since our finances became tighter after I took early retirement from the construction company. Her work was decent enough, though it never brought in the kind of money she claimed it did. "That sounds promising," I said, though something felt off. "What's his name?" "Marco Benedetti. He owns several high-end furniture showrooms across Europe. He's particularly interested in expanding into the American market." She paused, touching her pearl necklace nervously. "He's taking us to dinner Thursday night at Bella Vista. You know, that expensive Italian place downtown." Bella Vista. I knew it well. It was the kind of restaurant where dinner for two could easily cost $200, far beyond what we'd normally spend. But if this investor was paying, I supposed it made sense. "All right," I agreed. "What time?" 7 o'clock. "And William, please wear your navy suit. First impressions matter in business." What Leah didn't know, what she had never known in all our years together, was that I spoke fluent Italian. It wasn't something I advertised or felt particularly proud of. During my military service from 1978 to 1982, I'd been stationed at a communications base outside Naples. Those 4 years had given me more than just military experience. They'd given me a complete grasp of the Italian language. I'd learned it out of necessity at first, then out of genuine love for the culture and people. But when I returned home and met Leah 2 years later, I never mentioned it. She came from what she considered a more refined background, always talking about her college education and her sophisticated tastes. My working-class roots and military service seemed crude in comparison. The Italian felt like something too personal, too much a part of a version of myself I'd left behind. Over the years, there had been moments when my knowledge might have been useful or interesting to share, but somehow it never felt like the right time. It became my private thing, like a book I kept on a shelf but never discussed. Sometimes I'd listen to Italian radio online when Leah was out shopping, or read Italian newspapers on my tablet when she was busy with her design work. Thursday evening arrived with an unseasonable chill in the air. I dressed in my navy suit as requested, the same one I'd worn to my nephew's wedding 5 years ago. Leah looked stunning in a black dress I didn't recognize, with jewelry that seemed more expensive than anything I remembered buying her. When I complimented the necklace, she waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, this old thing? I've had it forever." We drove to Bella Vista in relative silence, Leah checking her makeup in the passenger mirror more times than necessary. The restaurant sat on the corner of 5th and Main, its warm golden light spilling onto the sidewalk through large windows. The scent of garlic, basil, and fresh bread greeted us before we even entered. The maitre d' led us to a corner table where a man was already waiting. Marco Benedetti looked to be in his early 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of confident posture that spoke of success. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, and his watch caught the light in a way that suggested serious money. "Leia, bellissima," he said, standing to kiss her on both cheeks. The familiarity of the gesture struck me as odd for a first business meeting, but I told myself different cultures had different customs. "Marco, I'd like you to meet my husband, William," Leia said, her voice slightly breathless. Marco extended his hand with a firm grip. "Pleasure to meet you, William. Leia has told me so much about you." "Likewise," I replied, though Leia had actually told me very little about him. As we settled into our seats, I noticed how Leia positioned herself slightly closer to Marco than to me. The waiter appeared almost immediately, as if he'd been watching for our arrival. Marco ordered a bottle of wine that I'd never heard of, but that made the waiter's eyes widen with appreciation. "So, William," Marco said as the wine was being poured, "Leia tells me you're retired from construction. That must be satisfying work, building things with your hands." There was something in his tone that felt condescending, though his smile remained pleasant. "It was honest work," I replied, "kept food on the table and a roof over our heads. Of course, very admirable." As the evening progressed, I began to notice things that made me uncomfortable. The way Leia laughed at Marco's jokes, throwing her head back in a manner I hadn't seen in years. The way she touched his arm when making a point. The way they seemed to share some private understanding that excluded me entirely. But it was when they began speaking in Italian that everything changed. At first, it was just brief exchanges. Marco would comment on the wine in Italian, and Leia would respond. I was shocked to discover that my wife spoke Italian at all. In 37 years of marriage, she had never mentioned knowing a single word of the language. "Non dovremmo parlare così davanti a lui," Leia said quietly. "We shouldn't talk like this in front of him." Marco glanced at me with amusement. "Non capisce niente, è completamente all'oscuro." He doesn't understand anything, he's completely in the dark. My blood ran cold, but I kept my expression neutral, continuing to cut my chicken as if I hadn't heard a word. They were talking about me as if I were a piece of furniture, assuming I was too ignorant to understand their conversation. "È così facile ingannarlo," Leia replied with a soft laugh. "It's so easy to deceive him." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to remain calm, to keep chewing my food and nodding along when they switched back to English to include me in meaningless small talk about the weather or the restaurant's decor. As the night wore on, their Italian conversations became bolder, more intimate. They discussed things that made my stomach turn, speaking about me with a casual cruelty that took my breath away. Marco called me Il vecchio stupido, the stupid old man. Leia laughed and agreed, adding details about our private life that she had no business sharing with anyone, let alone this stranger. I excused myself to use the restroom, needing a moment to collect myself. Standing in front of the mirror, I splashed cold water on my face and tried to process what I was hearing. My wife, of 37 years, was not only fluent in a language she'd hidden from me, but she was using that language to mock and belittle me with another man. When I returned to the table, they were deep in conversation in Italian, their heads close together. I caught fragments that made my chest tighten with something beyond hurt. "Presto sarà finita," Leia was saying. "Soon it will be over." "Hai fatto tutto quello che ti ho detto?" Marco asked. "Have you done everything I told you?" "Sì, tutto è a posto. Non sospetta nulla." "Yes, everything is in place. He suspects nothing." I sat down heavily, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my water glass. They barely acknowledged my return, continuing their conversation in English about Marco's supposed furniture business and Leia's design work. But now I could see it for what it was. A performance, a carefully constructed lie designed to fool the stupid old man who didn't understand anything. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I nodded and smiled when expected, made appropriate comments about the food and the business opportunity they claimed to be discussing. But inside, my world was cracking apart piece by piece. As we prepared to leave, Marco kissed Leia goodbye on both cheeks again. But this time I saw what I had missed before. This wasn't a professional farewell between business associates. This was intimate, familiar, laden with meaning that excluded me entirely. In the car on the way home, Leah chattered excitedly about the business opportunity, about how Marco was going to transform her little design consultancy into something much bigger. She talked about trips to Italy, about exclusive partnerships, about money that would change our lives. All I could think about were those words, "Presto sarà finita. Non sospetta nulla." Soon it will be over. He suspects nothing. I had no idea what they were planning, but I knew with absolute certainty that whatever it wasn't good for me. As we pulled into our driveway, past the garden I'd spent years cultivating and toward the house my father had left me, I realized that my marriage, my life, everything I thought I knew about the woman sleeping beside me every night, had been built on lies. That night, as Leia fell asleep next to me, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how long she had been living this double life. How long had she been speaking Italian? How long had she known Marco? And most terrifyingly, what exactly was going to be over soon? The next morning, I couldn't concentrate on anything. Leia bustled around the kitchen, humming Italian songs I'd never heard her sing before, as if the previous evening had filled her with new energy. She made coffee and toast with an almost manic cheerfulness that felt like salt in an open wound. "Wasn't Marco wonderful?" she said, buttering her toast with quick, excited movements. "I can't believe how lucky we are that he chose to work with us." I nodded absently, my coffee growing cold as I pretended to read the newspaper. The words blurred together as my mind raced with questions I couldn't ask without revealing what I knew. How long had this been going on? How had I missed the signs? "William, are you listening to me?" Leia's voice had that edge it got when she thought I wasn't paying proper attention. "Of course. Marco seems very professional." She smiled, that radiant expression that had once made my heart skip, but now felt like a knife twisting in my chest. "He is, and he's going to help us finally live the life we deserve." The life we deserve. The phrase stuck with me as she cleared the breakfast dishes and announced she was going shopping. After 37 years of marriage, I thought we'd been living the life we deserved, modest but comfortable, built on honesty and shared work. Apparently, I'd been wrong about that too. Once her car disappeared down our tree-lined street, I did something I'd never done before in our marriage. I went through her things. I started with her desk in the small room she'd converted into her office 3 years ago. The drawers were surprisingly organized, filled with fabric samples, client folders, and business cards from various suppliers. Everything looked legitimate at first glance, but in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of design magazines, I found a folder that made my blood run cold. Bank statements, not from our joint account that I knew about, but from an account I'd never seen before. An account in Leah's name only, with a current balance of $63,400. I sat heavily in her chair, my hands shaking as I flipped through months of statements. Regular deposits, always in round numbers. $2,000 here, $3,000 there, sometimes as much as $5,000 at once. The timing of the deposits made my stomach clench with recognition. They coincided with periods when Leia had told me her business was struggling, when she'd asked me to cover more of our household expenses. I thought back to the conversations we'd had over the past 2 years. How she'd worried about keeping her business afloat. How she'd suggested I cash in some of my retirement savings to help with our monthly bills. How grateful she'd been when I'd agreed to mortgage the house my father had left me to give her capital for business expansion. The house. My father's house. The one place I'd thought was secure. The foundation of whatever financial future we might have. I walked to the kitchen and pulled out the folder where I kept our important documents. The mortgage papers were there, signed by both of us 18 months ago. $45,000 against a house that had been paid off for 20 years. The money had gone into our joint account, and Leah had assured me it would be used for her business expansion and to pay down our credit cards. But looking at her secret account statements, I could see exactly where that money had gone. Regular transfers, perfectly timed to coincide with our mortgage payments, hitting our joint account. She'd been systematically moving our money, my father's legacy, into her private account. The phone rang, making me jump. I grabbed it on the third ring, my voice coming out rougher than intended. "William, it's Dr. Romano, our family physician. Leah and I had been seeing him for 15 years, ever since we'd moved to this neighborhood." "Hello, doctor. Is everything all right?" "I was calling about Leah's appointment yesterday. I wanted to follow up on the, test results we discussed." My mind went blank. Test results? There was a pause. "The blood work for her thyroid condition. She mentioned you'd been concerned about her recent weight loss and energy changes. The tests came back normal, which is good news." I gripped the phone tighter. Leah had lost weight recently, about 20 pounds over the past 6 months. When I'd asked about it, she'd said she was stress eating less because the business was going so well. She'd never mentioned seeing Dr. Romano about it, and she certainly hadn't mentioned thyroid problems. "Right," I managed. "That is good news." She seemed relieved. Said she'd been worried about how the stress might be affecting her health, especially with all the traveling she's been doing for work. Italy must be beautiful this time of year. Italy. She's been to Italy? Another pause, longer this time. "William, are you feeling all right?" Leah mentioned she'd been making monthly trips to Milan for the past 6 months to work with that investor of hers. She was concerned that you might be having some memory issues, actually. Said you'd been forgetting conversations and seemed confused about her travel schedule. The room spun around me. Monthly trips to Italy for 6 months. And she'd been telling our doctor that I was having memory problems, that I was confused and forgetful. "I'm fine, doctor. Just tired." "Well, if you have any concerns, don't hesitate to call. And William, Leah mentioned you've been having some chest pains. You really should come in for a checkup. At your age, it's important not to ignore these things." Chest pains. I'd never mentioned chest pains to anyone because I'd never had any. But apparently, Leah had been discussing my imaginary health problems with our family doctor. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the morning light streaming through windows Leah had insisted on updating with expensive custom treatments last year. Treatments that had cost $3,000 and had come, she'd said, from a special bonus client payment. Everything was starting to make a terrible kind of sense. The secret bank account. The trips to Italy I'd known nothing about. The stories to our doctor about my failing memory and mysterious health problems. Even her sudden fluency in Italian. How long had she been learning it? How long had she been planning this? I thought about Marco's words from the night before. "È completamente all'oscuro." He's completely in the dark. They hadn't been talking about my ignorance of Italian. They'd been talking about my ignorance of everything. The front door slammed, and I quickly shoved the bank statements back where I'd found them. Leah appeared in the kitchen carrying shopping bags from stores I knew we couldn't afford. "I got the most amazing fabric samples from that new boutique downtown," she said, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Marco is going to love them for the Milan showroom." "How much did you spend?" She waved her hand dismissively. "It's an investment, William. You have to spend money to make money." She began pulling out expensive-looking items, fabric swatches, design books, what looked like an Italian leather portfolio. Besides, Marco insisted on covering the expenses. He's so generous. I watched her arrange her purchases on the counter, her movements quick and excited. This was a woman I didn't recognize, someone who shopped without budget constraints and spoke casually about international business deals. When had she become this person? How had I missed such a fundamental transformation? "Dr. Romano called," I said carefully. She went very still for just a moment before turning around with a bright smile. "Oh? About what?" "Your test results. Your thyroid condition?" "Right, yes. Everything came back normal, thank goodness. I was so worried." She moved closer, reaching out to touch my arm. "William, honey, are you feeling all right? You look pale." "He mentioned you've been concerned about my memory." Her expression shifted to one of gentle concern, the kind you'd use with a confused elderly relative. "Darling, you have been having some issues lately. Yesterday you forgot that I told you about my business trip next week, and last month you couldn't remember where you put the insurance papers." I stared at her. This woman who had shared my bed for 37 years, who had eaten thousands of meals at the table my father built, who had promised to love and honor me until death do us part. She was lying to my face with the same ease she might use to comment on the weather. "What business trip?" "See, this is exactly what I'm talking about." She patted my arm in a way that felt patronizing. "I told you this morning that Marco wants me to fly to Milan next week to meet with his design team. It's a huge opportunity for us." Us. She kept saying us when she meant herself and Marco. "How long will you be gone?" "Just 4 days, 5 at the most." She turned back to her shopping, but I caught something in her reflection in the kitchen window, a smile that didn't match her concerned tone. "Don't worry, darling. I'll make sure Mrs. Patterson from next door checks on you." Mrs. Patterson was 82 years old and checked on me as if I were an invalid. The implication was clear. Leah was positioning me as someone who couldn't be trusted to take care of himself for 5 days. That afternoon, while Leah was supposedly meeting with a client, I drove to our bank. I'd never been the type of husband to monitor every penny, but I'd always had access to our joint account, or thought I had. "I'd like to review our account activity for the past year," I told the teller, a young woman who'd helped us many times before. She pulled up the records, and what I saw there confirmed my worst fears. Regular large withdrawals, always signed by Leah, always on days when she'd told me she was working late or meeting with clients. The pattern was clear. Money came in from my retirement deposits and the mortgage on my father's house, and money went out to her private account. But there was something else that made my heart race. Life insurance inquiries. Someone had been asking about my policy, the $300,000 policy I'd taken out years ago when we'd first gotten married. The inquiries had started 6 months ago, right around the time Leah had apparently begun her monthly trips to Italy. "Is there a problem, Mr. Harrison?" the teller asked. "No," I said, though my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. "No problem at all." Driving home, I tried to piece together the timeline. 6 months of trips to Italy, 6 months of secret financial planning, a lover who called me the stupid old man and spoke casually about things being over soon, a wife who was telling our doctor I had memory problems and health issues. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Leah's car was already there, though she wasn't supposed to be back from her client meeting for another hour. Through our front window, I could see her on the phone, gesturing animatedly as she spoke. Even from outside, I could tell she was speaking Italian. I sat in my car for several minutes, watching the woman I'd thought I knew, listening to the rhythm of a language I understood but had never shared with her. Tomorrow, she would fly to Milan to meet with Marco's design team. In 5 days, she would return with new stories about business opportunities and investment possibilities. But I wouldn't be the stupid old man anymore. I wouldn't be completely in the dark. As I finally got out of the car and walked toward my father's house, the house that might soon belong to someone else entirely, I realized something had fundamentally shifted inside me. For 37 years, I'd been living someone else's version of my life. It was time to start living my own. Leah left for Milan on a Wednesday morning, kissing me goodbye at the front door with the same casual affection she'd shown for years. But now I could see the performance in it, the way she tilted her head just so, the practiced concern in her voice when she reminded me to take my blood pressure medication. "Are you sure you'll be all right by yourself?" she asked, adjusting my collar like I was a child she was leaving with a babysitter. "I've asked Mrs. Patterson to check on you every day." "I'll be fine," I assured her, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face in half. After her taxi disappeared around the corner, I stood in my doorway for several long minutes, breathing the crisp morning air and trying to center myself. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt truly alone in my own house. It should have been liberating. Instead, it felt dangerous, like being alone with a truth too big to carry. I had 5 days to figure out what they were planning, 5 days to understand what presto sarà finita really meant. I started by going through Leia's office more thoroughly. This time, I wasn't just looking for bank statements. I was looking for anything that might explain the growing sense of dread that had settled in my chest like a weight. In the back of her filing cabinet, behind folders of legitimate client work, I found a manila envelope that stopped my heart. Inside were photocopies of documents I recognized immediately: my life insurance policy, my will, the deed to the house, even medical records from Dr. Romano's office. But it wasn't just that she had copies. Someone had annotated them in handwriting I didn't recognize. Marco's, I assumed. Notes in the margins about beneficiaries and payout timelines, question marks next to certain clauses. Most chilling of all, a yellow sticky note attached to my medical records with a single word written in Italian. Cuore. Heart. My hands trembled as I set the documents on Leia's desk. They had been studying my life like a business plan, examining every detail of what would happen when I was no longer in the picture. I remembered Dr. Romano's call about my supposed chest pains, the symptoms I'd never reported but that Leah had apparently been discussing with him. She was building a medical history, creating a paper trail that would support a particular narrative when the time came. The phone rang, making me jump so violently that I knocked over Leah's coffee mug. I grabbed it on the second ring, my heart pounding. "William, ciao, it's Marco." I gripped the receiver, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Hello, Marco. Leia's not here. She left for Milan this morning." See, I know. Actually, I wanted to speak with you." There was something different in his tone, a casual confidence that made my skin crawl. "Leia tells me you haven't been feeling well lately." "I feel fine." "Chest pains, no? At your age, these things can be very serious, very unpredictable." The word hung in the air between us like a threat. I said nothing. "Listen, William, I wonder if you might join me for lunch today. There are some business matters Leah and I have been discussing that affect you directly. You deserve to understand what we're planning for your future." My future. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Where did you have in mind?" "Do you know Rossini's?" "On Oak Street. Very quiet, very private. Perfect for sensitive conversations." I knew Rossini's. It was the kind of place where tables were spaced far apart and conversations couldn't be overheard. The kind of place where someone might say things they wouldn't want witnesses to remember. 1 o'clock? Marco suggested. "I'll be there." After I hung up, I sat in Leia's chair for a long time, staring at the annotated documents spread across her desk. Marco wanted to meet with me while Leah was safely in Milan. He wanted to have a conversation about my future in a private restaurant where no one would overhear us. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something beyond hurt and betrayal. I felt fear. But I also felt something else, a cold, calculating anger that surprised me with its intensity. If they thought they were dealing with a confused old man who would walk blindly into whatever trap they'd set, they were about to learn otherwise. I arrived at Rossini's 15 minutes early, choosing a table near the back wall where I could see the entrance. The restaurant was dimly lit, with heavy curtains and the kind of old-world atmosphere that suggested expensive wine and private deals. Perfect for Marco's purposes. He arrived exactly at 1 o'clock, dressed in the same expensive style I'd seen at Bella Vista. But today there was something different about his demeanor. Less charming, more businesslike. The mask was slipping. "William, thank you for coming." He slid into the seat across from me, signaling the waiter with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to getting immediate attention. "I hope you don't mind. I took the liberty of ordering wine, a very good Barolo." "That's fine." I kept my voice neutral, my hands steady on the white tablecloth. "You seem nervous," Marco observed, studying my face with the calculating look of a predator sizing up prey. "Should I be?" He laughed, but it was a cold sound. That depends entirely on how reasonable you choose to be. The waiter appeared with the wine, going through an elaborate presentation that Marco clearly expected. After the glasses were poured and we were alone again, Marco leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. Let me be direct, William. Leah and I are in love. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd suspected as much. Hearing it stated so casually, so matter-of-factly, made something inside me shrivel up and die. How long? I managed. 2 years, maybe longer. He shrugged as if the timeline was irrelevant. She's been very unhappy in your marriage for quite some time. You must have sensed that. I had sensed it, actually. The gradual cooling, the way she'd stopped asking about my day or sharing details about hers. The way we'd become polite strangers sharing the same house. But I'd attributed it to the natural evolution of a long marriage, not to betrayal. She wants a divorce, of course, Marco continued, swirling his wine. But there are complications, financial complications. Such as? Your house, your retirement savings, the life insurance policy. These things are substantial, but in a divorce, especially given your age and health issues, the settlement might not be as favorable as we'd hoped. Health issues. There was that phrase again, spoken as if my supposed medical problems were established fact rather than convenient fiction. I see. Marco leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. But there is another solution, a simpler one. My blood turned to ice. Go on. Men your age, with heart conditions, often have sudden episodes. Very sad, very natural, especially when they're under stress. He paused, taking a sip of wine. The stress of discovering your wife's affair, for instance, that kind of shock can be fatal. The restaurant seemed to fade around me. The quiet conversations at other tables, the clink of silverware, the soft jazz playing in the background, it all became white noise as Marco's words settled into my consciousness like poison. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about a natural death brought on by emotional trauma and pre-existing health conditions. His tone was as casual as if he were discussing the weather. It happens all the time, especially to men who discover their wives have been unfaithful. I forced myself to take a sip of wine, using the gesture to buy time while my mind raced. And Leah knows about this plan? Whose idea do you think it was? The words hit me like a sledgehammer. My wife, the woman who had shared my bed for 37 years, who had eaten dinner with me almost every night for decades, who had stood beside me at my father's funeral and promised to love me in sickness and in health, had planned my murder. When? My voice sounded strange, distant, like it was coming from someone else. Soon, very soon. Leah is establishing an alibi in Milan as we speak. When she returns, she'll discover that you've learned about our relationship. The shock will trigger a heart episode. By the time the paramedics arrive, it will be too late. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small vial filled with clear liquid. This will help ensure the desired outcome. Tasteless, odorless, mixed into your evening medication, it will cause symptoms that perfectly mimic a massive heart attack. The autopsy will show an enlarged heart, arterial blockage, all the signs of natural death in an elderly man under severe emotional distress. I stared at the vial, this small glass container that represented the end of my life. You've done this before. I'm a businessman, William. Sometimes business requires creative solutions to complex problems. And if I refuse to cooperate? If I call the police right now? Marco's smile turned predatory. Who would believe you? A confused elderly man with documented memory problems and paranoid delusions? Leah has been very careful to establish your mental instability with your doctor, your neighbors, even your own family. If you try to accuse us of anything, it will only reinforce the narrative that you're suffering from dementia. He was right, and we both knew it. Leah had been building this trap for months, maybe years. Every conversation with Dr. Romano about my supposed memory issues, every concerned comment to the neighbors about my confusion, every worried phone call to distant relatives about my declining mental state, it had all been preparation for this moment. Of course, Marco continued, and there is an alternative. Which is? You could simply disappear. Leave town, start over somewhere else. Leah would get the house, the insurance money, everything, but you would keep your life. And live as what? A fugitive from my own existence? Better than the alternative, don't you think? I sat in silence for several long minutes, letting him think I was considering his offer. In reality, I was memorizing every word he'd said, every detail of his expression, every nuance of this conversation that I would need to remember later. Finally, I set down my wineglass and met his eyes. I need time to think. Of course, but not too much time. Leah returns on Sunday. Things will need to be resolved by then. He stood up, dropping money on the table for the wine we'd barely touched. It's been a pleasure talking with you, William. I do hope you make the smart choice. As he walked away, I noticed he'd left the vial on the table, partially hidden beneath his napkin, a final, casual reminder of how easily he could end my life. I sat alone for another 20 minutes, staring at that small glass container and trying to process the magnitude of what I'd just learned. My wife wanted me dead. Not divorced, not separated, dead. She had planned it with her lover with the same attention to detail she brought to her interior design work. But as the shock began to fade, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't just afraid, I was angry. Furious, actually. For 37 years, I had been a faithful husband, a reliable provider, a man who kept his word and honored his commitments. I had given Leah the best years of my life, and she had repaid me with betrayal and murder. They thought they were dealing with a confused old man who would either die quietly or run away in terror. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. I picked up the vial and slipped it into my pocket. Evidence. Then I paid my own bill and walked out of Rossini's into the afternoon sunlight, already planning my next move. If Leah and Marco wanted to play games with life and death, I would show them how the game was really played. I drove home from Rossini's in a daze, Marco's words echoing in my mind like a death sentence. The small vial in my pocket seemed to burn against my leg, a constant reminder of how close I was to the end they had planned for me. But as I pulled into my driveway and looked at the house my father had built with his own hands, something crystallized inside me. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to die quietly. And I sure as hell wasn't going to let them get away with this. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my old Army buddy, Frank Peterson. Frank had retired from the military and become a private investigator, specializing in divorce cases and insurance fraud. We'd kept in touch sporadically over the decades, Christmas cards and the occasional phone call, but I hadn't spoken to him in almost 3 years. William Harrison. Frank's gruff voice came through the phone. Well, I'll be damned. How are you, old friend? I need help, Frank. The kind of help that requires discretion and experience with difficult situations. There was a pause. Frank had always been sharp, and he caught the seriousness in my tone immediately. What kind of trouble are you in? The kind where my wife and her lover are planning to murder me for the insurance money. Another pause, longer this time. Jesus Christ, William, are you sure about this? Dead? Sure, literally. Can you talk freely? Yes. Leah's in Milan establishing an alibi. I have until Sunday before she comes back to put their plan into action. All right, listen to me. Don't touch anything in the house that might be evidence. Don't change your routine in any way that might seem suspicious. And whatever you do, don't let them know that you know. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? Where? Remember that diner we used to go to near the base? Mel's. It's still there. 9 a.m. I'll be there. William, be careful. If they're willing to kill you, they won't hesitate to move up their timeline if they suspect you're onto them. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, looking around at the space where I'd eaten thousands of meals with a woman who was planning my death. The cherry cabinets I'd installed myself 15 years ago. The tile backsplash Leia had insisted on updating last spring with money that had apparently come from my own stolen savings. The breakfast nook where we'd shared coffee and conversation every morning for decades, most of it apparently lies on her part. But I couldn't afford to wallow in self-pity. I had work to do. I started by going through the house methodically, looking at everything with new eyes. If Leah had been planning this for months, there would be evidence. People who plan murders don't do it on impulse. They prepare, they research, they make mistakes. In our bedroom, I found the first piece of the puzzle. Hidden in the back of Leia's jewelry box, behind a tangle of costume necklaces I'd seen her wear for years, was a small digital recorder, the kind that could fit in a purse or pocket, the kind that could record conversations without anyone knowing. My hands shook as I played back the most recent recording. It was my voice talking to Dr. Romano during my last appointment 6 months ago. I remembered the visit, just a routine checkup, nothing serious. But listening to it now, I realized Leah had been sitting in the waiting room with that recorder running, capturing every word. "Any chest pain, shortness of breath?" Dr. Romano's voice asked. "No, nothing like that," my voice responded. "Good, good. Your blood pressure's a little elevated, but that's normal for your age. Any stress at home? Changes in routine?" "Not really. Leah's business has been keeping her busy, but nothing I can't handle." "How's your sleep? Any trouble with memory, concentration?" "Sleep's fine. Memory's still sharp, thank God." The recording cut off there, but I could see how it could be edited, taken out of context, used to support a narrative about failing health and cognitive decline. Combined with whatever lies Leah had been telling Dr. Romano separately, it would paint a picture of a man in rapidly declining health who was hiding his symptoms out of pride or denial. I found more recordings hidden in various places throughout the house, conversations with neighbors, phone calls with the bank, even casual remarks I'd made about feeling tired after working in the yard, all of it carefully documented, ready to be used to build the case for my deteriorating condition. But the most damning evidence was in her laptop. Leah had always been careless with technology, never quite grasping the importance of strong passwords or secure browsing. It took me less than 10 minutes to crack her login. Our anniversary date, of course. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her browser history told the story of a woman planning murder with the same methodical approach she brought to interior design. Searches for undetectable heart attack drugs, life insurance payout timelines, symptoms of heart failure in elderly men. She'd visited forums where people discussed poisons, read articles about forensic investigations, even researched the specific drug Marco had shown me at lunch. But it was her email account that provided the smoking gun. Months of correspondence with Marco, all in Italian, love letters mixed with detailed planning sessions. They discussed my routines, my health, my financial situation with the cold precision of predators stalking prey. "Il vecchio sta diventando sospettoso," Leah had written 3 weeks ago. "The old man is becoming suspicious." Marco's response: "Dobbiamo accelerare la tempistica. Non possiamo permettere che scopra la verità. We need to accelerate the timeline. We can't let him discover the truth." But the email that made my blood run cold was from just 2 days ago, sent after our dinner at Bella Vista. "Credo che abbia capito che parlo italiano. Il modo in cui mi guardava. Forse dovremmo agire prima del previsto." I think he realized I speak Italian. The way he looked at me. "Maybe we should act sooner than planned." Marco's reply was brief. "No. Aspetta il mio segnale. Domenica sera, come abbiamo discusso. Il farmaco è pronto." "No. Wait for my signal. Sunday evening, as we discussed. The drug is ready. Sunday evening. In 3 days, they plan to kill me." I printed out every email, every search history entry, every piece of evidence I could find. Then I carefully covered my tracks, making sure there was no digital trace of my investigation. If they checked the computer later, they would find everything exactly as Leah had left it. The next morning, I drove to Mel's Diner, a greasy spoon that had barely changed since Frank and I used to grab breakfast there, 45 years ago. Frank was already waiting in a back booth wearing the same serious expression I remembered from our military days. "You look like hell," he said by way of greeting. "I feel like it." I slid into the seat across from him and pushed a manila envelope across the table. "Everything's in there, emails, recordings, bank records, the poison Marco gave me yesterday." Frank's eyebrows shot up. "He gave you poison?" "Showed it to me anyway. Said it would mimic a heart attack." I pulled the vial from my pocket and set it carefully on the table. He left it behind accidentally, as a reminder of how easy it would be to kill me. Frank examined the vial without touching it, then opened the envelope and began reading through the documents. His expression grew darker with each page. "This is some cold-blooded stuff, William. Your wife's been planning this for at least 18 months, maybe longer. The financial manipulation, the medical gaslighting, the character assassination, it's textbook spousal murder preparation. Can we stop them? We can do better than that. We can destroy them." Frank leaned back in the booth, his mind already working on the angles. "But it's going to require you to play along for a few more days. Can you handle that?" "What do you mean?" "We need to let them think their plan is working. Let Leah come home on Sunday, let her put whatever plan they have into motion, but we'll be ready for them." "You want me to let them try to kill me?" "I want you to let them think they're killing you." Frank smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "Trust me, old friend. By the time we're done with them, they'll be the ones facing a life sentence." Over the next hour, Frank outlined his plan. It was elaborate, risky, and required precise timing. But if it worked, Leah and Marco wouldn't just be caught red-handed, they'd be trapped by their own greed and arrogance. "The key," Frank explained, "is making them think they've succeeded. We let them go through with their plan, let them poison you, let them watch you die. Then, when they're celebrating their victory, we spring the trap. And if something goes wrong, if the fake poison isn't fake enough? That's why we have backup plans, medical support on standby, antidotes ready, the whole 9 yards. You'll never actually be in danger, William, but they won't know that." As we finalized the details, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope for survival, but hope for justice. Leah and Marco had underestimated the stupid old man. They were about to learn just how costly that mistake could be. "There's one more thing," Frank said as we prepared to leave. "Once we do this, there's no going back. Your marriage will be over, obviously. But more than that, you'll know exactly what your wife thought of you, exactly how little your life meant to her. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the question as I drove home, past the familiar landmarks of a life I was about to leave behind forever. The park where Leah and I used to walk on Sunday afternoons. The church where we'd gotten married 37 years ago. The tree-lined streets where we'd built what I thought was a happy life together. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had my answer. I was more than prepared for the truth. I was hungry for it. Let Leah come home from Milan thinking she was returning to finish off a confused, helpless old man. Let Marco believe he was dealing with an easy mark who would die quietly and conveniently. They wanted to play games with my life? Fine. Game on. Sunday arrived gray and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cuts right through your coat and settles in your bones. I stood at my kitchen window watching for Leah's taxi while trying to calm my nerves. In a few hours, my wife of 37 years would try to murder me. The thought still seemed surreal, like something from a television drama rather than my own life. Frank had spent the previous 2 days setting everything up. Hidden cameras in strategic locations throughout the house. Audio recording equipment that could capture conversations from 3 rooms away. Medical personnel standing by just outside our neighborhood, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. Most importantly, he'd replaced Marco's poison with a harmless substance that would create the symptoms they expected, without actually endangering my life. "Remember," Frank had told me during our final briefing the night before, "you need to sell this performance completely. They can't suspect for even a second that you know what's happening. Act confused, vulnerable, maybe a little paranoid. Give them exactly what they expect to see. At 3:15 in the afternoon, the taxi pulled up. I watched from behind our living room curtains as Leah paid the driver and gathered her luggage. She looked radiant, refreshed from her trip. The trip where she'd been establishing an alibi while her lover prepared to murder her husband. I was sitting in my recliner pretending to doze when she walked through the front door. "William? Honey, I'm home." Her voice carried that artificially bright tone she'd been using more often lately, the one that sounded like she was performing happiness rather than feeling it. "In here," I called out, adding a slight tremor to my voice that wasn't entirely fake. She appeared in the doorway, still wearing her traveling clothes, her face arranged in an expression of loving concern. "Oh, sweetheart, you look tired. Have you been taking care of yourself? Mrs. Patterson checked on me yesterday, brought me some soup. That's nice." Leah set her purse on the coffee table and sat on the edge of the sofa, studying my face with what I now recognized as calculation rather than concern. "How are you feeling? Any chest pain? Shortness of breath?" There it was, the setup. She was already planting the seeds for what was to come. "A little tired, maybe. Nothing serious." She nodded, as if filing away the information. "Well, you should probably take it easy tonight. I brought you something from Italy, some special tea that's supposed to be very good for circulation." Special tea. I wondered if that was how they planned to deliver the poison. "That sounds nice. How was your trip?" Leah launched into an animated description of her time in Milan, talking about meetings with Marco's design team and opportunities for future collaboration. She was a good actress, I had to give her that. If I hadn't known the truth, I would have believed every word. But I did know the truth, and watching her perform this elaborate lie made my stomach turn. This woman had shared my bed for decades, had comforted me when my father died, had celebrated every small victory, and commiserated over every disappointment. Now she was sitting 3 feet away, planning the final details of my murder. "Marco sends his regards, by the way," she said casually. "He's flying back tomorrow to finalize some business arrangements. He might stop by to see how you're doing." How I was doing. The euphemism was almost funny. The afternoon passed in a strange simulation of normalcy. Leah unpacked her luggage, showing me small gifts she'd supposedly bought in Milan. She cooked dinner, my favorite pot roast, which should have been a comfort but instead felt like a condemned man's last meal. We watched television together on the sofa, her hand occasionally reaching over to touch my arm or check my forehead for fever. Every gesture was perfectly calculated, designed to reinforce the narrative of a loving wife caring for an increasingly fragile husband. If I died tonight, everyone would remember how concerned she'd been, how she'd noticed I wasn't feeling well, how she'd tried to take care of me in my final hours. At 8:30, she went to the kitchen to make the special tea. I listened to her moving around, opening cabinets, running water. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she'd be able to hear it when she returned. This was it, the moment of truth. In a few minutes, she would hand me a cup of tea laced with what she believed was a lethal dose of cardiac medication. "Here we go," she said, returning with a steaming mug on a small tray. "This should help you sleep." The tea smelled like chamomile with an underlying medicinal odor that made my skin crawl. I accepted the mug with hands that shook only slightly, perfect for someone with supposedly failing health. "Thank you. You're always taking such good care of me." Something flickered across her face at those words. Guilt, regret, or just annoyance that I was being sentimental at an inconvenient moment. "Drink it while it's hot," she urged. "It works better that way." I lifted the mug to my lips and took a small sip. The liquid was bitter beneath the chamomile flavor, with a chemical aftertaste that confirmed what I already knew. Frank had been right. They were using a drug that would simulate heart failure, probably something that would be difficult to detect in a standard autopsy. "It's good," I lied, taking another sip. different from what we usually have. It's a special blend. Marco recommended it specifically for circulation problems. I drank about half the tea, then set the mug down and leaned back in my chair with a satisfied sigh. That hits the spot. I think I might turn in early tonight. That's a good idea. You need your rest. But instead of the loving concern that should have been in her voice, I heard something else. Anticipation. She was waiting for the drug to take effect, watching for the first signs that her plan was working. I didn't have to wait long to give her what she expected. Frank had coached me on the symptoms: chest pain, shortness of breath, confusion, and eventually collapse. The harmless substitute they'd given me would actually produce mild versions of these effects, making my performance more convincing. 20 minutes after finishing the tea, I pressed my hand to my chest and winced. "William, what's wrong?" "Just a little tightness, probably nothing." Her eyes sharpened, and I saw her glance at the clock. Right on schedule. 5 minutes later, I doubled over with a groan, clutching my chest with both hands. "Something's wrong, the pain, it's getting worse." "Maybe I should call 911, she said, but her tone lacked urgency. She was going through the motions, establishing her concerned wife routine for when the authorities asked questions later. No, it's probably just heartburn. Help me to the bedroom. I'll lie down for a while." She supported me as I stumbled toward our room, my performance becoming more dramatic with each step. By the time we reached the bed, I was gasping for breath and clutching my left arm in the classic signs of cardiac distress. "William, you're scaring me," she said, but I could hear the excitement beneath her fear. This was exactly what she'd been waiting for. I collapsed onto the bed, my breathing becoming increasingly labored. Through half-closed eyes, I watched her watch me, saw the way she calculated each symptom against whatever timeline Marco had given her. The phone rang, making us both jump. Leah answered it quickly, and I could tell from her side of the conversation that it was Marco checking in. "Yes, he drank it all. About 40 minutes ago. Yes, it's working exactly like you said it would. No, I don't think we should call anyone yet. Let's wait a little longer." Let's wait a little longer. Until I was dead, she meant, until there was no chance that medical intervention could save me. I let my breathing become more and more shallow, my movements weaker and more erratic. This was the most important performance of my life, and I couldn't afford to overdo it or underdo it. It had to be perfect. "William?" She leaned over me, her face a mask of fake concern. "Can you hear me?" I managed a weak nod, then let my eyes roll back slightly. According to Frank's research, this would be about the time that the real drug would cause loss of consciousness. I think I need help," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Shh, it's okay. Everything's going to be okay." But as she said those words, I saw something in her expression that chilled me to the bone. Relief. She was relieved that I was dying. After 37 years of marriage, the woman I'd loved and trusted was actively looking forward to my death. My breathing became increasingly irregular, with longer and longer pauses between breaths. I let my body go completely limp, my eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. For several long minutes, Leah just sat there watching me, waiting, making sure I was really gone before she called for help and began her grieving widow performance. Finally, she reached for the phone. 911? "Yes, I need an ambulance. My husband, I think he's having a heart attack. He's not breathing." Her voice was perfect, panicked but trying to stay calm, devastated but coherent enough to give clear information. She provided our address, described my symptoms, answered all their questions with exactly the right mix of fear and helpfulness. "Please hurry," she sobbed into the phone. "I can't lose him. We've been married for 37 years. The performance was so convincing that for a moment I almost believed it myself. Almost forgot that this was the same woman who had been planning my murder for months. But then I heard her make a second call. "It's done," she said quietly, presumably to Marco. "He's gone. The paramedics are on their way, but there's nothing they can do now. Yes, exactly like you said. Very peaceful, very natural. I'll call you after they take the body away." The body. That's what I was to her now. Not William. Not her husband of nearly 4 decades. just a body to be disposed of, so she could start her new life with Marco. I lay there in our bed, listening to her prepare for the arrival of the paramedics, and I felt something I'd never experienced before, the cold satisfaction of knowing that justice was about to be served. Leah had no idea that every word she'd spoken, every phone call she'd made, every moment of her carefully orchestrated murder plot had been recorded by Frank's hidden cameras and microphones. She thought she was minutes away from freedom and a $300,000 insurance payout. Instead, she was about to discover that the stupid old man she'd married wasn't quite as stupid as she'd thought. The sound of sirens filled the air as the ambulance pulled into our driveway. I remained perfectly still on the bed, maintaining my death performance while Leah rushed to let the paramedics in. Her footsteps echoed through the house, quick and nervous as she practiced her grieving widow act one final time. "He's in here," I heard her tell them, her voice cracking with perfectly manufactured emotion. "I think it was his heart. He's been having problems lately, and tonight he just collapsed." The paramedics entered our bedroom with professional efficiency, their equipment rattling as they set up around what they believed was my corpse. But these weren't real paramedics. They were part of Frank's elaborate setup, trained actors who knew exactly how to play their roles. "Ma'am, I need you to step back," one of them said, gently moving Leah away from the bed. "Let us do our work." They went through all the motions of attempting resuscitation, checking for vital signs, using medical equipment that beeped and hummed convincingly. The whole time, Leah stood in the doorway watching, her face a perfect mask of hope and desperation. "Is there anything you can do?" she asked, right on cue. "Please, he's all I have." "I'm sorry, ma'am," the lead paramedic said after several minutes of theatrical effort. "There's nothing we can do. He's been gone for too long." Leah let out a wail that would have been Emmy-worthy if I didn't know it was completely fake. She collapsed into a chair, sobbing into her hands while the paramedics covered my body with a sheet and prepared to transport me. "We'll need to take him to the hospital," they explained. "The coroner will need to examine the body, but given his age and medical history, it appears to be natural causes, a heart attack most likely." Natural causes. Exactly what Leah and Marco had planned for. After they loaded my supposedly lifeless body into the ambulance, I was driven to Frank's facility, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town where he'd set up a complete surveillance center. The real paramedics were waiting there to check me over and make sure the substitute drug hadn't caused any actual harm. "You're one hell of an actor," Frank said as I sat up on the stretcher. "Even I almost believed you were dead." "How long do we wait?" I asked, accepting a cup of coffee that tasted like life itself after hours of pretending to be dead. "Not long. She's already made the call to Marco. He's on his way over to console the grieving widow. Once he arrives, we'll have everything we need." Frank showed me the monitor displaying feeds from the cameras hidden throughout my house. Leah had stopped crying the moment the ambulance left. Now she was moving through our home with brisk efficiency, checking to make sure she hadn't left any evidence lying around. She went straight to her office and pulled out the folder containing copies of my insurance policy and will. Then she made a phone call. "Yes, I'd like to report a death and begin the life insurance claim process. My husband, William Harrison, policy number—" She rattled off the details with the kind of calm competence that suggested she'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times. Watching her plan my financial funeral while my body was supposedly still warm made me feel sick to my stomach. But it also filled me with a cold satisfaction. Every word she spoke was being recorded, every action documented for the prosecution case that would destroy her life. 20 minutes later, Marco's car pulled into our driveway. Leah met him at the door, falling into his arms with renewed sobs that were only slightly more convincing than her earlier performance. "It's over," she whispered as he held her. "He's really gone." "You did perfectly," Marco murmured, stroking her hair. "No one will ever suspect anything. The old fool never knew what hit him." They moved to the living room, where I could see them clearly on Frank's monitors. Leah poured 2 glasses of expensive wine, probably the bottle she'd been saving for this exact celebration. "To freedom," Marco said, raising his glass. To us, Leah replied, clinking her glass against his, and to never having to pretend again. They talked for over an hour, dissecting every detail of their plan with the pride of criminals who believed they'd committed the perfect murder. Marco praised Leah's performance with the paramedics. Leah marveled at how easily the poison had worked. They discussed their future together. The house they would buy in Italy, the business they would expand, the life they would build on the foundation of my death. The insurance money will take a few weeks to process, Leah said, curled up against Marco on the sofa where I'd sat with her thousands of times over the years. But once it comes through, we can disappear. No one will ever connect us to anything suspicious. And the house? Marco asked. I'll sell it as soon as the estate is settled. William's father built it himself, so there's a lot of sentimental value that will drive up the price. I'm thinking we can get at least $400,000 for it. My father's house. The home where I'd spent my childhood, where I'd brought Leah as a bride, where I'd planned to live out my final years in peace. She was already calculating how to profit from its sale before my body had even reached the morgue. What about the neighbors, his friends? Won't they find it suspicious that you're selling so quickly? Marco asked. Leah laughed, a sound that was pure ice. Are you kidding? They all think I'm the devoted wife, who can't bear to live in the house where my beloved husband died. They'll probably help me pack. That's when Frank decided we had enough. The front door burst open with a crash that shook the whole house. FBI agents flooded into the living room, weapons drawn, shouting commands for Leah and Marco to put their hands where they could be seen. Through the monitor, I watched my wife's face transform from confusion to shock to absolute terror as she realized what was happening. Marco tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Within seconds, they were both on their knees with their hands zip-tied behind their backs. Leah Harrison, Marco Benedetti, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, insurance fraud, and elder abuse, the lead agent announced. This is insane, Leah screamed, her composure finally cracking completely. My husband died of natural causes. You can't prove anything. Actually, we can, Frank said, walking into the room with a laptop computer. We have video evidence of you poisoning your husband's tea. We have recordings of you planning his murder. We have documentation of your financial crimes. And best of all, he paused for dramatic effect, then smiled. We have your husband's testimony. William Harrison isn't dead, Mrs. Harrison. He's very much alive, and he's been watching your little celebration. The blood drained from Leah's face so completely that for a moment I thought she might actually have a heart attack. Marco began shouting in what I assumed was profanity, though I was grateful I couldn't understand the words. That's impossible, Leah whispered. I saw him die. He wasn't breathing. You saw what we wanted you to see, Frank explained. Your husband has been working with law enforcement for the past week to document your murder plot. The poison you thought would kill him was actually a harmless sedative. Every word you've spoken tonight has been recorded. An hour later, after Leah and Marco had been taken away in handcuffs and the FBI had finished collecting evidence from my house, I finally returned home. Frank walked with me to the front door, his expression a mix of satisfaction and concern. You know this is going to be all over the news, right? He warned. Attempted murder plots always draw media attention. Let them talk, I said, surprising myself with how little I cared. The truth is the truth. What will you do now? This house, it's going to have a lot of memories. I looked around at the home I'd shared with Leah for so many years, trying to feel some sense of loss or nostalgia. Instead, all I felt was relief. The lies were over. The pretense was finished. For the first time in months, maybe years, I was completely free to be myself. I think I'll redecorate, I said finally. Get rid of anything that reminds me of her. Maybe learn to cook something besides the meals she used to make. Hell, maybe I'll even take that trip to Italy I always talked about. See the places where I learned the language that saved my life. Frank grinned. Sounds like a plan. And William, for what it's worth, I'm proud of you. Not many 65-year-old men would have had the courage to fight back the way you did. After he left, I walked through my house slowly, seeing it clearly for the first time in years. Tomorrow, I would start the process of reclaiming my life. I would redecorate this place or sell it and move somewhere new. I would reconnect with old friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. I would travel, read, maybe even write the story of what had happened to me. But tonight, I simply sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the garden I'd tended for decades. In a few hours, Leah and Marco would be arraigned on charges that would put them away for the rest of their lives. The $300,000 life insurance policy they'd coveted would remain untouched. The house they'd planned to sell would stay in my name. Most importantly, the stupid old man they'd underestimated was still alive, still breathing, and finally truly free. As I sipped my coffee and watched the morning light filter through the windows, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 days ago, I'd been a man living a lie, married to a woman who was planning my death. Today, I was alone but honest, betrayed but victorious. It wasn't the ending I would have written for my story, but it was the ending I deserved. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that was enough. 3 months later, I received word that Leah and Marco had been sentenced to 25 years to life for attempted murder and conspiracy. They would grow old in prison while I grew old in freedom. Justice, it turned out, was worth waiting 65 years to experience. The house felt different now, larger somehow, filled with possibilities instead of secrets. I'd kept my father's furniture but replaced everything that reminded me of Leah. New curtains, new bedding, new dishes. I was building a new life in the shell of the old one. Sometimes, late at night, I would think about the woman I'd married 37 years ago and wonder if she had always been capable of murder or if something had changed her along the way. But those thoughts never lasted long. Some questions don't have answers worth knowing. What mattered was that I had survived. Not just the attempt on my life, but the slow poisoning of my spirit that had been going on for years without my realizing it. I had reclaimed my dignity, my home, and most importantly, my truth. At 65, I was learning to live again. And it felt like the greatest victory of my life.